To start off with, just tell me a little bit about your background as it relates to reactive attachment disorder and developmental trauma.
Sure. I adopted two kids out of foster care
Mhm.
in 2006, ages 2 and 3, a girl and a boy, and they both had attachment issues. My son, though, in particular, was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, and he had pretty severe symptoms. He's now a young adult, but I've spent about the last 2 decades living reactive attachment disorder.
So, we're going to talk today about the differences between a rage and a tantrum. So, talk to us a little bit. What is the difference between a rage and a tantrum?
So, a tantrum is age appropriate for a child who's between the ages of, say, 2 and 3, maybe 4. They last, say, 5 to 10 minutes. And, you have that kind of picture we all have in our head of a kid who's tantruming, where they're laying on the floor and they're kicking their legs. Maybe they're crying or throwing toys. Um, Tantrums are mostly about disappointment or frustration in an age appropriate way. And importantly, kids who are in the middle of a tantrum, typically they can engage and connect with you as a parent. Um, and there's an identifiable demand. So, for example, they're wanting a toy or there's a need because they're hungry or tired. So, if you have a 3-year-old who's, let's say, they're throwing a tantrum because they want a cookie, if you hand them the cookie, they'll stop throwing the tantrum. But if you have a child who's raging and you hand them the cookie, they're just going to throw it across the room and they're going to keep raging because raging is a whole different thing. Um, so when kids are raging, they're really out of control and they can't stop. They can't calm down. And a lot of rages last longer. My son's rages used to last hours. And also that aggression, instead of just kind of, randomly kicking or throwing around their arms, a lot of the times that aggression is towards people in a rage. And also there can be really significant property damage. So instead of ripping up your coloring page like you might do in a tantrum, the child who's in a rage, they might rip the door off the hinges. So it's the level of intensity is much, much higher. And that's why, of course, tantrums aren't dangerous, but rages can be dangerous. So they're just a much more serious thing.
All right. And how does minimizing language, like saying a tantrum instead of a rage, kind of contribute to misunderstandings around what parents are dealing with reactive attachment disorder?
So tantrums, again, they're a normal part of a child's development. So if we say that our child is having a tantrum when they're actually having a rage, what we're conveying to whoever we're speaking to is that our child's behavior is normal and that it's neurotypical. They're getting that picture in their head of the 3-year-old laying on their back, kicking their feet, crying. And so, of course, if that's the picture in their head, they're not going to understand when we're saying that my child's behavior is too much for me to handle, or it's dangerous, or I'm afraid, because those are ridiculous ways to describe a tantrum, because we're not talking about a tantrum here, we're talking about a rage. So I used to um, use the word tantrum for my son's behaviors all the way till he was probably about 8 years old. And then there was a social worker who came into my home and she actually witnessed one of these episodes. And after she witnessed it, she said to me, she said, "You have got to stop calling these tantrums. These are not tantrums, they're rages. And you're going to get more help if you use the word rage." And I have to tell you, that was the best advice I've ever received. I immediately started doing it. And I did notice that I was able to get more help because when you use the word rage with a professional like a therapist, or maybe you're trying to get your kid into a mental health hospital or something like that, you're conveying much more accurately what you're experiencing, that what you're experiencing is scary, it's high intensity, it can be dangerous, and that it's something you can't easily manage. So I do think it's one of my key pieces of advice that I like to give is, if your child's experiencing a rage, make sure you're using the word rage, not tantrum.
All right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And what can work for a tantrum that doesn't work for a rage? I know you mentioned maybe giving the child what it is they're wanting would work in a
Mhm.
tantrum and not in a rage. What are some other things that kind of,
That's right. That might not be the best parenting advice, but it would work, right? Another, I think the most common thing people talk about is holding space. And so what they mean by that is, let's say your child is throwing a tantrum, they want you to get down on their level, use a calm voice, try to connect with them. You might say, "I know it's really disappointing when you can't have a cookie, and it's okay to feel sad." And so what you're doing in that moment is you're co-regulating with your child. You're modeling how to calm down, and then you're guiding them through the calming down process so that eventually they can learn how to do that on their own. Anyone who's had a child with a reactive attachment disorder who's raging knows that holding space, it's just not realistic when your child's raging because your child could be hurting themselves. They could be hurting siblings, or they could be hurting a pet. They could be causing really significant property damage. So it's just not a realistic advice for a parent who's dealing with a rage. But that's the advice we often get, that type of advice. And a lot of times it is because of the language we're using.
What should you do if your child is raging? What can you do?
So I think that you have to focus 100% on safety and de-escalation. So if your child is raging, that's not the time to teach them or to discipline them or to even try to connect with them. You just want to focus on safety and de-escalation and just getting through that episode. And one thing you definitely don't want to do is threaten consequences. There is a great video on YouTube that I would recommend to anyone by a psychologist named Jacob Ham, and he compares a child who's in a rage to the Hulk, and he talks about how when the Hulk is hulking out, or what we would consider like a rage, if you shoot or threaten the Hulk, that's only going to make him stronger and less able to reason. And he talks about how that's the same with our kids. When they're in that moment, they can't reason. And when we threaten consequences and we say, okay, now you're grounded for 2 weeks, up, now you're up to 3 weeks, that's going to feel like very threatening to them because of their early childhood trauma. And that's only going to escalate them. And we also really have to remember that when a child is in that rage moment or episode, their body is literally flooded with adrenaline. So it's just a biological reality that it's going to take a while for that adrenaline to work through their system and for their body to calm down. So even if you're telling them to calm down, they physically cannot calm down in that moment. So to de-escalate, a few things I would suggest. One is, of course, you don't really want to make eye contact with them. You want to reduce stimulation. So, like, let's say the TV's on in the background, you want to turn that off. You also definitely want to reduce the audience because our kids tend to escalate when there are other people watching. If you have other people in the room during the rage, if you can remove them from the room, that can help your child. Don't grab your phone and start videotaping them. That can escalate them. Don't touch them unless you have to. Obviously, if there's a significant threat or danger, you may have to, but try not to touch them and get in their space. In general, you're just looking to be as non-threatening as possible so that you can give them that space to calm down. And again, not just mentally to calm down, but for their body to calm down because their body is just surging with adrenaline. And the other thing I do want to mention, because a lot of people don't talk about this, we talk about how do we de-escalate our child during the rage, but we also need to talk about how do we de-escalate ourselves, right? Because as parents, we're being asked to do, it's a lot to handle a child, that level of aggression, level of disruption, sometimes for hours. And, our hearts are racing, we're frustrated, we're angry. It's very hard for us to be that calm parent that we need to be. So I think another thing to think about is how we can de-escalate ourselves and remain calm. One piece of advice that I really like, which is in the book A to Z of Therapeutic Parenting, which is one of my favorite books. The author Sarah Naish talks about how if you have a child that is raging often, one thing you should do is focus on filling your home with things that are inexpensive and easily replaceable. So that could be, you have furniture from the thrift store. Obviously, you don't want them ripping apart the furniture. You don't want them writing on it, but you're going to feel a lot differently about that if it's a couch from a thrift store that they're tearing up with scissors or something like that. Same thing with if you have for their toys, put away stuff that is nostalgic for you because you're going to have a better chance at emotionally regulating yourself if let's say they rip the head off a doll. If that's an $8 doll from Walmart, have no connection to, you're going to be able to stay calm a lot more easily than if they're ripping the head off a doll that was your childhood doll that you love and have this emotional connection to. So I think that's some really practical advice that would need to be done proactively if you have a child who's raging a lot. You also, as a parent, need to walk away. You need to know when you just have to get yourself away because you're going to lose it because you emotionally are engaging and you're having a hard time calming down. So sometimes you've got to go lock yourself in the bathroom for 5 minutes and give yourself a break. And kind of to that end, you also really have to look at when is this too much to handle? So a lot of times parents can't handle the being asked to handle the level of rages that are happening in our homes, I think that's one of the most damaging myths that is told is that we should be able to handle this. Something is wrong with us because we can't. I don't think that's true. I think in many cases, we're being asked to handle something that we just aren't equipped to handle. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that. And really key to that is, is your child in these rages hurting themselves or hurting others? It could be pets, it could be you, it could be siblings. And also, are you having to physically restrain them, especially as they're getting older? Those kind of are two key things to when you need to start looking at maybe this is too much for me to handle and too much for my home, and I'm going to need to look to get some help.
And when you mean looking to get some help, would that be calling the police or, um,
So, in the moment, perhaps calling the police, but what I really mean is looking at it more strategically. If your child is consistently having these rages that are so out of control where people are getting hurt or you're having to restrain them, that's when you're going to need to start looking at should I get, should I be putting my kid in out-of-home placement? Do I need to get different types of medications? That's when you need to start looking for help beyond just typical parenting and trying to manage those behaviors.
all right. Yeah, and speaking of help, what are some ways in which advocates can help families name these things and also kind of deal with these situations or options in these situations?
So I think having an advocate um, can be very helpful in validating your own experience and your own feelings. It can help you process what's happening, help you kind of determine are these tantrums or are they rages? It's because, of course, kids with a reactive attachment disorder have tantrums just like any other kid. So what you may be experiencing could be a tantrum or it could be a rage, and they can kind of help you talk through that and understand what you're facing. They can also help you create a safety plan, and that's very individualized. For myself, it used to be my kids knew, my other children knew when their brother was, getting into one of these rage episodes, they would run to my bedroom because my bedroom had a bathroom. They had a door lock. They could lock themselves in and be safe. Or I might call my sister to come pick them up. Other safety plans can include things like, proactively making sure things like knives are hidden or locked away. And again, it's very individual depending on what type of raging your child's having, your own situation. But that's something that an advocate from RAD advocates can help you with is coming up with that individualized safety plan. And you spoke about calling the police, understanding like when does it make sense to call the police and having that information ready. I also think that one thing that's really helpful about RAD advocates in particular is that the people who are connecting that you would connect with have personal experience with this, but they still have some distance because they're not in your actual home. And so they can see what you can see. And when you're dealing with a kid with reactive attachment disorder, I think one of the issues can be it's hard for you to really fully grasp and have perspective on what's happening. So those people can look at what's happening and they can help you understand, what is the best approach for me? Can I use a safety plan? Is that going to work in my home, or do I need more help? Do I need to look at out of home care? And those are all the types of things that I think having an advocate can help you process and work through.
And I know you've been very involved with RAD Advocates from the beginning, and it sounds like you'll be at the next conference. Do you want to talk a little bit about your work and what you'll be doing at the conference?
Sure. I'm really excited to be speaking again. The NAVRAD conference is unique. It's unlike any other foster or adoption or attachment conference that you would go to because it's really more of a guided experience where you're learning and they're helping you use the information you're learning to reflect on your individual situation. And then at the end, you actually walk away with a plan for your family. And those plans are individualized and unique, and there's no judgment about where you feel that you need to go with your family, but you're actually walking out of there with a plan to move forward. My talk in particular is going to be on redefining success. So I'm going to be talking about being realistic, resetting your expectations, and how you can use that to find a way forward.
Kind of circling back to our topic of rages and tantrums, how can parents be empowered to use language that better protects them and also validates their experience?
So I think with family and friends, it's important to really explain the difference between a tantrum and a rage. Most of your family and friends probably don't know the difference. They probably also don't understand reactive attachment disorder. They don't understand why a child who has had trauma at a young age might actually begin to rage and what that is, not just psychologically, but also biologically. And so I think it's really important to try to give them that information and explain that to them. I think with therapists and professionals in general, I think they definitely understand there's a difference between tantrums and rages, at least in my experience, but they don't like to use the word rages. They, I think, kind of shy away from that. They would rather try to normalize what's happening in your family. So to counteract that, I think it's important to always use the word rages if that's what your child is exhibiting. And then really focus on when you're talking about the rage, describing the symptoms that differentiate it from a tantrum. So talking about the length of time, saying, my child had a rage last week and it was an hour and 45 minutes long. And emphasizing my child is 9, right? Because a 9-year-old shouldn't be throwing tantrums. That wouldn't be age appropriate. Talking about the aggression and anger, because that's not typical of a tantrum. Talking about how your child is unable to calm down, you're unable to connect with them in that moment. So, really focusing on describing the features of the episode so that you can clarify for them that this is indeed a rage and get better advice from them. And based on my own personal experience, I also think it's really important when you're describing those rages to focus on safety, particularly if your child has siblings, focusing on how those episodes are affecting everyone else in the home as well as the safety of that child. And that can be a really good way to communicate with a therapist or professional in a way that they can hear you and understand the issue, and they can focus on giving you advice that does work, not, sit with your child and things like that that are not going to work.
Speaking of that, how can we educate professionals on the benefits of recognizing the difference between a rage and a tantrum and kind of supporting parents with those needs that are different for our families?
I think that they definitely know the difference between a rage and tantrum. I think that there's a real gap in the mental health community about understanding reactive attachment disorder and tying that to a rage. So I think that there needs to be some work on that. I think as parents, the most important thing that we can do is again to, use the word rage, to focus on those distinguishing behaviors, but then also to be really careful about how we're presenting ourselves. So by the time I started getting help for my son, I literally had lost my mind. I was one of those crazy mothers who was going in and ranting and raving. And so when you do that, it's really easy for a therapist to just write this off and say, oh, this is just a parenting issue. She's just an angry mom. And so I think it's really important that when you are talking with your a professional, like a teacher or a therapist or someone, that you're really presenting yourself in a calm way. You're being reasonable. You've written down notes about the last episode, so you're not, exaggerating anything. You're just giving exactly what happened, and you're speaking in good faith. And I think that that is one of my biggest regrets why I actually didn't get meaningful help for my child for a while is it took me a couple of years to learn that I needed to present myself in a really calm and reasonable way. So I think that can help a lot.
For sure. Let's see, those were kind of my main bullet point questions, but what else would you like to add on this topic?
So I guess just another word about the NAVRED conference. If your child is raging, especially, I really encourage you to try to find a way to come. Not only will you learn a lot, but you'll connect with other parents and be able to build your support system. And so I know it can be really difficult. It would have been very hard for me to have attended a conference when I was in the middle of raising my child with RAD, but I do think it's extremely beneficial if you can find a way to do that.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. I went to the first one and it's awesome. So
Yeah, it is. It's amazing.
thank you.